hey there, it's your old pal Keith from wavetables.lol. That's wavetables.lol, home of KRC math waves. Easily the world's largest collection of wavetables, single cycle waveforms, and even some samples for all sorts of modern synthesizers, including our brand new friend somewhere here, Serum 2, which just dropped out of nowhere, at least from my perspective, yesterday afternoon, bringing the X4 Records site basically down like it was being DDoSed, because the entire world, it seems, wanted to get Serum 2. I was not part of the beta testing process for this. It's capable of really interesting things, and it's a very interesting synthesizer. I'm not doing like a full review here today. It's just like, this is a thing that has to be talked about because it's Serum. It's Serum 2. I was researching how long I've had Serum, and apparently I acquired Serum in 2014, which, according to the manual, the manual up here? Oops, wait, what's happening? Where'd my manual go? Where did my Serum manual go? Let's see. Menu, read the manual. This is good advice. Always read the manual. I was looking at the documentation, the user guide for Serum 2, and the copyright notice is that it's copyright 2014 to 2025 by X4 Records, which I guess I pronounce that X4 Records. In my head, I always think about it as being Transfer Records. Only Steve Duda could answer that for sure. Like, what is it, Transfer or is it X4? Anyway, Serum 2 got announced. It got a bunch of traction on Twitter, I guess, and on Reddit, and basically everyone at once like tried to get the update. So I've had this synthesizer since it came out in 2014, and I have to say, even though it was my first wavetable synthesizer and gave me exposure to, the concepts of wavetable synthesis, it mostly I used it for getting access to single cycle waveforms and putting them into wavetables, as a way of exploring different waveform sounds. And that was, I would use it with galbanum architecture waveforms, which is a product from that period that had about 29,000 waveforms in it, some of them very interesting. That then I took that same concept, about 18 months ago or so now, and built my own library of single cycle waveforms and wavetables that is now known as KRC math waves. Anyway, blah, 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 talky. Like and subscribe for more talky synthesizer content. This isn't like a review of Serum 2, because there's a bajillion videos already from people who are way more experienced with Serum than I am. Like, just because I've had it since 2014 doesn't mean that I've spent a significant amount of time with it. And like I say, the thing that I was mostly interested in, right, was the wavetable editor at that time, and that's here. You can build wavetables in this thing. You can draw stuff. You can use the formula parser to develop new wavetables. That's very interesting. All this is in the documentation, which is quite good. And it's quite good in the new version of Serum 2. But it has to be talked about, right? Because Serum is like a very important piece of technology. Even though I didn't really love it, and I didn't respond to the original version of Serum the way that I did to, say, Korg Modwave, which like really made me nuts for wavetable synthesis, because it just presented in a different way. Serum is very important. Like, there are whole genres of electronic music, and particularly EDM, electronic dance music, where some of the sounds that Serum does and the approach that Serum encourages in terms of sound design are fundamental to those genres. So it's extremely exciting that this new version of the synth has dropped. And, I think everybody knows this by now. It's a free update. So if you own the original version of Serum, Serum 2 is just yours. You can tip the X for Records team if you want to. I did when I went to download this, and I was finally able to get into the site late yesterday. I tipped them a little bit of money, but they're not asking anything for the update if you already own it. And I'm itchy. Why does this always happen? I saw another YouTuber the other day who also was like, "Oh my God, my nose itches." I'm like, "Is this a thing? Like when you record a YouTube video, does your face itch? Like what is up with that?" I don't know. I don't know. So Serum 2 is like it's a great update. I mean, obviously, if you already own the product, like just go get it. Go to X for Records. There'll be links in the description. There's always links in the description. Because it's a really interesting update. And I do want to talk about it. I haven't done any videos that are specifically about Serum, even though Serum is one of the most important wavetable synthesizers. We actually owe a bit of a debt of gratitude. Play something, Keith. Oh, I need to turn off this on my master chain here. What do I have here on master? I've got some sort of, I've got ozone on there. There we go. Let's reduce our latency. It makes all the classic wavetable sounds. I did want to talk about a few things because of course Serum 2 does work with KRC math waves. Math waves is was designed in part for Serum, also for Korg mod wave and Vital and all of those things. But I would say we owe a debt of gratitude to Steve Duda and the original version of Serum for the common wavetable format that we now sort of know as the de facto standard. So one of the coolest things that Serum did is that instead of having some specialized wavetable format, Steve was smart enough to understand that you don't need a special format. You could just put 2048 sample per frame single cycle waveforms together and just call that a wavetable. And so Serum supports basically any number of 2048 single cycle waveforms just appended to each other, and that becomes a wavetable. It handles up to 256, I think. I don't know if that's changed in Serum 2, like if it supports a larger number or not. But that's really cool, right? Because there's no special format. Things like phase plant are the bane of my existence because it insists on having basically pre-computed wavetables that have 256 waveforms inside of them. This makes them huge, even though they can be stored as FLAC. It's just kind of nonsense. So Serum was really smart on that, and that format is also used in Vital. It's also supported by Korg mod wave. You can import those types of wavetables and they turn into a Korg wavetable. Although mod wave only supports up to 64 frames, which is how I author my wavetables. They don't ever have more than 256 unique frames. For phase plant, I pre-compute the morphs, and also for wave edit format, I pre-compute the morphs to be exactly 64 frames. But one cool thing about wavetable synthesis, right, is that you can have as few as like one waveform. Here in this particular patch, I have not had it really any time to work with Serum 2 yet. Just beyond the basic playing around. But you'll see like this wavetable has 4 unique waveforms in it, and then as we morph the wavetable position, we we interpolate between those frames. Now, one of the weird things about Serum actually is that though it's always been a wavetable synthesizer, it didn't actually, it had the concept of interpolation between frames. But it was like an afterthought. And I think what the original version did is that if you had fewer than 256 frames, um, you would have a wavetable where you'd snap to the individual waveforms, and then you could go to the editor and you could do an interpolation. I don't know where they've moved that in the new interface, and I wasn't really going to talk about this, but basically you would say, oh, okay, now interpolate these frames, and it would fill them in, and you would have a 256 frame wavetable. In Serum 2, it's finally picked up on the fact that mostly what you want to do with wavetables is morph them. And so if you right click on the position button now, there's this option for smooth interpolation. So we can either have interpolation on or off. And this is more what we would expect from a wavetable synthesizer. So in a way, this feature, I think, is kind of establishing feature parity with things like Korg Modwave and things like Vital, which I think interpolates by default. Um, I'd have to I'd have to launch Vital to check that out. Anyway, so okay, so like that's a nice normal wavetable thing that we would do. And so it's great that it's here. This is also part of a patch now. So, if you're creating your own init patch, which is something I'm going to have to do actually, because the init patch in Serum is pretty bare bones. It doesn't have, the typical modulations that I would use already set up. Which is maybe one of the reasons that I never really cottoned to it. I do like the fact that you've got two different views. You've got a 2D view and a 3D view of wavetables, which is, pretty neat. Oops, and I didn't mean to go into the editor. I was just trying to get you back to 3D mode. Loading wavetables. This is really one of the main things I wanted to talk about. In Serum, I've never had to make how to import wavetables to Serum video like I have for some of the other software synthesizers that support wavetables, because it's pretty obvious how it works. So you can go to the menu, and then you can open the Serum 2 presets folder. It's the same thing in old Serum. You would open the Serum presets folder. Inside, you've got folders for all of the different things that can be saved. One of these is tables, and then under tables there's a user folder, and there's a little notepad file, right, that says save your wavetables in this folder. Right? And so all you do is, like, say you get KRC Math Waves or KRC Orchestral Impressions. You just take a folder of wavetables and you put it in here, and then you have access to them. So, I could, let's see, I could go to user and let's look at the hybrid Bezier maybe. My volume's a little low, isn't it? And then once you're inside a folder, right, you've got like back and forth arrows that let you navigate between all the different wavetables that are in there. So that's cool, right? Very straightforward. It does sort of suck, actually, that I don't think the user folder responds to symbolic links. So, like, you can't just have a shortcut in there to a folder that's somewhere else on your system that is where you store your wavetables. I think you do have to physically, digitally copy them into that folder. That's a little suboptimal. If I had been betaing, I'd have been like, there's a giant collection of wavetables out there, and some people use them in all sorts of synthesizers, and we just want to point to a directory and be like, hey, this is a directory I want to use with the synthesizer. I don't want to have to copy the thing because it's gigabytes of content, right? But there it is. So beyond wavetable synthesis, one of the things that that Serum 2 has is it has a whole bunch of new oscillator types. So it used to be, just a wavetable synthesizer. It had a dedicated sub oscillator that can, be different types. And it had a noise oscillator that was sample based. So we'll listen to the noise oscillator here. It's very, very quiet, isn't it? It's turned down in this patch. Makes noise, right? But in addition now to sample-based noise, and keep in mind that in KRC Math Waves, there's a whole sample collection called Varieties of Noise that's awesome for use with things like Serum's noise oscillator. You could load samples from Varieties of Noise into the noise oscillator. And the noise oscillator it's also generically a sample oscillator, but it can just hold a single sample, and there's not a lot of fancy pants stuff to it, right? But in Serum 2, in addition to wavetables, we now have multi-samples. So there's a multi-sample type oscillator. Let's go to a patch. Again, I haven't really had any time to make any patches for Serum 2. But it supports multi-samples now. And it does come with some pretty nice multi-samples. The other thing, let's see. Let's grab can we grab an ah here? Oh, a little low on the keyboard for that one. Classic choir girls kind of sound. It's actually quite pretty. I don't know the source of these, where they came from. Perhaps that's in the manual. I don't know. I haven't read the entire manual yet. But there's a multi-sample oscillator. Now, I do want to make some notes here. Again, this is not a review. Anything I'm saying here is I'm just pointing out some of the idiosyncrasies of Serum 2. It's really cool that it supports multi-samples. Again, this is kind of a feature parity thing, right? I really think the impetus, though it's just a good idea in itself, probably the impetus for having a multi-sample module is the fact that Korg ModWave supports multi-samples, right? It has its own format and it has its own sample builder application for making multi-samples. And this brings me to a point I want to make. Did I save a patch here? One of the things that I think is I didn't. One of the things that's a little bit annoying about the multi-sample module is that it supports SFZ format. So that's sound font format. A lot of stuff in Serum 2 is kind of back to the future, I'm going to say. I haven't really thought about sound fonts in a long time. And the sound font format, was used kind of back when like Serum was first out, kind of in the 2000s and 2010s, as a kind of generic, it's JSON-like format for specifying how samples are mapped to a keyboard. And so I remember things like Rapture and Dimension Pro, which were in Cakewalk. Those are the kind of early virtual synthesizers as like, supporting sound font. And so I have a whole ton of sound fonts on this machine in my loops and samples folder, but there is a problem because, and I can tell that the folks who beta tested this were not primarily old people, because old people like myself would have given feedback on this almost immediately. While it's cool that this supports SFZ, it's got to support something, right? And SFZ kind of is the only open, multi-sample mapping format that's out there. It's not quite implemented right. So like if we go to, let's see, load SFZ, if we go over to my loops and samples folder, let's see, where am I? There they are, Dimension Pro samples. So inside here, I've got a bajillion sound font files. And so the SFZ file just specifies like where where a sample lives and then how it's supposed to be mapped to your keyboard so you can play it in a sampler. Let's go get our friend. Where is Morris White? Morris is in here somewhere. There we go. Morris Ooze. Now, you can almost immediately hear a problem. I'm going to turn down the volume here. It's a little hot. These samples are beautifully and perfectly looped, but they don't loop here when we load them into the multi-sample. And the reason for that is that rather than the loop points being specified in the SFZ file, which is a thing you can do, there's all these things called opcodes in sound font format. So there's an opcode for like loop start and loop end, where you just specify like what is the starting sample for the loop and what is the ending sample for the loop, and then there's opcodes for the behavior. Does the thing loop on sustain or does it loop in release, et cetera, et cetera. But it's very common, actually, for sound fonts not to have that information inside of them. And instead, the loop points are in the wave file themselves. They're in the metadata. So one weakness of this first release of Serum 2 is that it doesn't understand that. And so I don't think this would be very hard to add, but it would probably make life a lot easier if when you loaded an SFZ, if it noticed that the wave files had loop points, there'd be an option to say, yeah, use the loop points, right? Otherwise, people are going to have to reauthor a whole bunch of sound font files. It wouldn't be hard for me to write a Python script to do this. And I probably will, because I would love to play this sound inside of this synthesizer, because who doesn't love a little Maurice White from Earth, Wind, and Fire? But it doesn't work right now. So what I would have to do, right, is write a script to like walk this directory of SFZs and go find all the wave files. And then if the .sfz file doesn't have loop start and loop end, then it would write those parameters into the file after looking at the wave. It's just a pain in the ass. And then I would wind up with, thousands of extra SFZ files around. So anyway, that's one little limitation, but I think it's very exciting that Serum 2 supports multi-samples. And like I said, I mean, there's some good factory content in here, I think. Let's look at the glockenspiel. Ooh, it's very high up. Now, one thing that's really interesting about all the new oscillators, and we'll get to the other ones, is that just like with the wavetables, they support a lot of the same stuff. So you've got unison mode on everything. So multi-samples can have unison. Now, that's not unusual, I guess. ModWave does this too. But unison is at the oscillator level. It's not kind of at the layer or the patch level, which is very interesting. So you can have an oscillator that is making unison voices combined with another one that is not, right? And there's no filter in this patch, right? We're in like a little init thing. In addition to the multi-sample oscillator, there's just a sample, so a single sample oscillator. I expect that we might have a resurgence in like cheesy dance industrial music, or maybe like tech house that's highly sample based, because I think this is going to be a lot of people's first exposure to sampling and multi-sampling, right? There's a lot of people that have Serum, and it's like it's their only sauce synth. It's like they've got their DAW and they got Serum, and that's their production environment, right? There's nothing wrong with this, but it's like if it's not in Serum, it doesn't exist to them. So I just expect we're going to be hearing a lot more like vocal sampling and stuff in music coming up. I'm really into like oh, this isn't actually, that's not a sample. Wait a minute, where's a single sample? Okay, so, here's a single sample oscillator. So this is like a single vocal sample, right? So not a multi-sample, but it's just a single sample that's mapped all the way across the keyboard. You know, there are loop facilities in here, so you can set like the start and end loop point, right? Things can be one shot or they can loop. I don't know if Serum automatically detects loop points in a wave file. I haven't even had the time to check that out yet. But it actually has a nice facility for crossfades. Like, so it's this little gadget over here. You just drag that. So you can hear we have some ticking now, right? Because this is not a well-chosen loop point, right? But we can get rid of that a little bit just by crossfading the loop. And it's a beautiful visualization. I think this is really smart. So just as a simple little sampler instrument, this is really cool. Sometimes you do just want a single sample and you want to play it. And then, there's other stuff you can do with that. You've got forward-backward looping. We don't have things like the old Insonic bow tie crossfade loop and fancy stuff like that. But that would be interesting if they implemented that. And I assume that the loop start and loop end are completely modulatable. Should we try it? Can we drag LFO1 to loop end? And let's see. Modulate it up. Oh yeah, we can. That's interesting. So nice little sampler stuff, right? The other thing that I don't know what relative loop means. I suppose that means it can move around. I really need to read the manual on that. But this is very interesting. So you got multi-samples, you have single samples, then you also have a spectral oscillator. So Serum can take a piece of audio and transform it into the frequency space. And I think this is one of like the best features that it has. So here's where I took that single sample. I think it's the same. Yeah, it's the same one. And put it into the spectral oscillator. And that's as simple as just doing this. Like, check out. So we'll do like, here's single sample loop, right? If I just click in here, let's see, we can switch it to a wavetable, but we can also, if we just go to spectral, like all of a sudden that sample that's loaded in here, now it's a spectral sample. And so in this kind of technique, it's basically a resampling a resynthesis technique. Now like time and pitch are disconnected. It still has looping. We can shut that off if we want to, I guess. But time is separated from pitch, so we can slow things down radically. Or even make them like static if it's at 0. Or we can scan through it faster. And of course, scan is modulatable. And the other thing that's super interesting, and I did mention this in passing before, is that you've got like the warp modifiers that we typically associate with wavetables. They also apply to the other kinds of oscillators. So like there's a hard clip option. We can distort the F out of this guy, which is, kind of unexpected, right? There's filters built into here. I mean, of course, there are also filters in the synth, but you've got filters that can be right in the spectral oscillator, which is very interesting. You can do FM from the other oscillators. You can do phase distortion, amplitude modulation, ring modulation on any of the oscillators, not just wavetables. So this opens up some very interesting, sample fuckery, right? I think that's really fascinating. And then when you're in spectral oscillator mode, there's a whole bunch of other spectral operations that you can do. Like you can blur the sample, like smear is basically kind of a blurring operation. Let's turn our scan back to 100%, shall we? And let's maybe turn looping back on. A little quiet. So see, here's a smear down and a smear up. Kind of spectral blurring effect. Lots of other things that can be done here. You can spread the harmonics. That's pretty neat. Let's see, there's a detune. Very interesting stuff. A lot of like fun, just a lot of fun sound morphing possibilities here. You can synthesize other harmonics. That's pretty neat with samples like this. You can synthesize subharmonics. Oh, and that's clipping. That's, what do we want that at? -10 or so? Super interesting, right? It's like, wow, that's fascinating. And I'm gonna say that like the spectral oscillator, this was free to me, but I'm gonna say that the spectral oscillator is almost worth the price of admission here. So Serum 2 is on sale at an introductory price of $189. I think then it goes to $249 after the intro period. I've been thinking for months, actually. I'm like, I wish I just had like a cheap and cheerful, like simple instrument that I could load like single hits into, like you heard in the intro, and just play them back because at you chromatically, right? Without having to jump through a lot of hoops. And like Serum gives you that. Now that's not like, I don't think that's a main feature of this synthesizer, and that's maybe something that's idiosyncratic to me. But you know, I like to play hits like this, you know, chromatically on the keyboard. And the quality is like really good. And then also we can mangle our samples a little bit, you know? You know, like we could smear this guy out. Boy, levels are all over the place. It's just really fun. It's just something I really like to do. I mean, there's whole genres of music made like this, right? It's like, chill out. You know, and we can combine these together in multiple oscillators. Another thing that's really cool. Another thing that's really cool in Serum 2 is that there's 3 oscillators now. So you've got a sub, you've got the 3 well-specified oscillators that can be of all these different types. I didn't mean to click there. Right, we've got wavetable, we've got multi-sample, we have single sample, there's a granular engine. I haven't even played around with the granular engine yet. Like I'm more attuned to spectral approaches, I would say, but granular can be really fun. You know, it's just so great to have this. And I have a feeling that we're going to hear sounds like this in a lot of upcoming music as people are like, oh, now I've got all this kind of stuff. That's not a bad thing. It's not a bad thing at all. You know, but we've got 3 oscillators now and then the noise oscillator, which is really cool. You know, I'm not a huge Serum head, but there is a more well-specified kind of mixing facility now. So you've actually got like multiple buses where things can be sent. There's a main effects rack and then an effects rack for each of the 2 buses. So you can have sort of, you know, 3 parallel chains of effects. The effects are very nice. You know, there's some interesting new reverbs, like this nitrous one. Let's turn the mix all the way up on this guy. It's like, real swimmy, and so sort of a shimmer reverb, I guess, but it's got a lot of like pitch detune in it. You know, this reminds me a little bit of some of the types of effects that you can do in Dawson Myth. Um, you know, and you know, this scratches the itch that I was hoping that Dawson Myth would, right? Like one of the reasons I thought Dawson Myth might be interesting is I thought its resynthesis, I love that. I thought its resynthesis, right, like might enable, you know, like I was saying, this cheap and cheerful playing of single hits. And that didn't really come until DAWSOM 1.5 came out and the quality of the resynthesis really improved. You know, but really all I needed all along was just a thing like this, just a nice spectral oscillator that just does a good job of separating time from pitch. That's really fun to use. And, you know, again, like you've got unison on everything. So you can put like tons of unison voices at the oscillator level, which is just really super interesting. Where's the unison detune? What am I missing? You know, and scan can slow things down. Anyway. And that's just really pretty stuff. You know, works great with vocal samples as well. Let's see here. Yes, we are living in the aerospace, space age. So it's very interesting, actually, you know, that the display here animates as we animate this spread warp parameter. Another thing that's not in Serum is there's now 2 warp parameters, so you can have like both of these things at the same time, which is kind of neat. So this is a low-pass filter that's right here. There's also this spectral filter, so you can emphasize or de-emphasize certain frequencies spectrally. And I assume this is all modulatable somehow. That's what I meant about, I think we might see a return to weird types of industrial influenced music. Anyway, Serum 2. I think it's really lovely, actually. It's not my favorite wavetable synthesizer. I think ModWave is still that for me. But I will probably do, at long last, some patches for Serum 2 because I find it much more inspiring than the original version. You know, it was always a professional synthesizer, but I just think it's really up-leveled and it's kind of more interesting to work with now. It is, I have to say, it's idiosyncratic, right? Like, there's level controls all over, and you saw me kind of futzing around with gain staging over the course of this video. You know, and the question is like, where is the amplifier? Where's the amplifier? You know, there's kind of not an amplifier in Serum. In fact, like if you want to do like velocity to amp, like I think you have to do it this way. You go to the matrix, the mod matrix, and there's a dedicated option for it. Create velocity to amp assignment. So now we've got, I had one already, but so now we've got velocity to amp because I don't think that the amp control is actually visible anywhere, which that's kind of weird. But you know, other things that are new here, the filters have been redone. So there are Serum 2 filters. They include some new ones, like a WSP is obviously a WASP inspired filter. It's very noisy and sort of buzzy. but very pleasant. They sound great. I think all the filters sound great. The effects are very interesting. They're more than serviceable. You know, like the way that people use Serum in certain kinds of dance production, right? Like is in a lot of ways it's all about the effects rack that you have in Serum. You know, there's all sorts of techniques like using multiple OTT compressors, right? The what do they call it? It's hyperdimension, right? Which is like unison, but in the effects rack. You know, these kind of effects are sort of all over certain dance music genres. You know, so it's like, I'm cutting out a little bit there. You know, if you don't have Serum already, and if you have Serum, well, now you have Serum too, just go get it. It was free. If you don't have Serum already, is it essential? There's a lot of options now for wavetable synthesizers. You know, there's Phase Plant, there's Korg Modwave, there's Korg Multipoly, you know, which is also a wavetable synthesizer that also has very interesting sounding filter emulations and emulation of oscillator drift, which is something that Serum doesn't really do. We could create patches that have some randomness to them and, you know, that sound kind of analog-y. I have a whole video about doing that in Modwave. We could apply those same kind of tricks in Serum, but you know, Serum is more surgical. Really, it's not really about that kind of randomness. It's about having a lot of control over the oscillator, right, and a lot of different modifications that you can make to an oscillator. So you know, I think it's very interesting that Serum 2 is out at this time, you know, as it is. You know, I suspect that, you know, Phase Plant maybe was probably eating a lot of Serum's lunch. You know, there's also Pigments. You know, Pigments, when it was on sale, maybe it's still on sale. Like, it was on sale for like $49 recently, or maybe it was 99. Anyway, I bought it. I did a whole video about it. I was like, oh, I need to have this now. So, you know, Serum at 189, it's a lot of sonic possibility. And so I would say it's like actually highly recommended. I'll definitely be revisiting Serum in the future. And, you know, I'll probably do a video when I release some patches for Serum 2, which will, of course, be, you know, mostly based on my custom wavetables. Anyway, super interesting. You know, it wasn't on my dance card to even do a video this week, but like we had to talk about Serum 2. Did I cover every topic that I wanted to about Serum 2? I probably did. You know, it's an important synthesizer, and it's very interesting. I think it's more fun than ever to work with. Oh, it's got 8 macro controls now. That's pretty cool. These are like mod knobs in multipoly or wave state or the mod wave. It's kind of the same concept as the Korg R&D synths, although they're also modulation destinations, which is kind of nice. There's 10 LFOs now, so after you use the 6th LFO in a patch, you'll actually see more of them. They appear. I do wish that maybe, you know, with all of this modulation stuff you can do, right, between like, you've got two different warp modes, right, that are independent. You've got wavetable position, you know, you've got pitch and blah, 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 blah. It might be nice to have more than 4 envelopes, but maybe that's being greedy. I mean, it's probably mostly enough for most applications. There's a bunch of new stuff that like I'm not like super excited about, but there's like a clip launcher. There's an arpeggiator now. I think the ARP is pretty interesting. Whoa, that is like eating up a lot of CPU, isn't it? I wonder why that's happening. You know, there maybe is more CPU impact from Serum 2. Maybe that's the new filters. I don't know. Oh yeah. I guess another thing about the Serum that's kind of interesting is while its modulation architecture is quite robust, I mean, I don't think you're ever at risk of like running out of modulations in the modulation matrix. It's not fixed in any way. It doesn't have a concept of layers, so it's like a one layer, three oscillator synthesizer. Was it a missed opportunity not to adopt a layer type architecture? Like we see in things like multi-poly and mod wave? Maybe. But I also feel like Serum is it's very DAW-centric, right? So I have a feeling that the people who use Serum, if they want to do something that's like layers, well, they would just add another instance of Serum, right, to another track. So I suppose that's, one way of dealing with the issue of it doesn't have layers. But, now that you've got like so many interesting oscillators in here, it is sort of a shame that you can't just like, kind of take one patch and, layer it with another one, right? That would open up, I think, some very deep sonic possibilities, but maybe it would be too CPU intensive. I don't know. Anyway, it's super interesting. Hey, go check it out. I think there is a trial mode for Serum too. I think it just runs for 15 minutes at a time, probably disables saving and stuff like that. But I think, if you don't have it and you've wanted to get it, I think this is one of the best opportunities because it's on intro price at $189. I think it's worth it. And the guys at X4 Records have been true to their word. Like they said when I bought this in 2014 that there would be free lifetime updates, and updates to Serum have not been very frequent. It's like Serum just appeared and it's like, here it is, it's a finished thing. It's had some bug fixes and some little feature additions. But mostly it's been the same product since 2014. But, here we are in 2025 and Serum 2 comes out and it's free. So that's really awesome. Anyway, tip of the hat to Steve Duda and the other kids over there at X4 Records. Hey, have a great day. Be good to one another. And I will talk to you later.